Hello, and welcome to this new YouTube channel. I am the comfortable narrator. Please find a nice and comfortable place where you will feel at ease. And while we read The Devil and His Boy by Anthony Horowitz. Mind you, I do not claim ownership of anything I'm going to read, and I give full credit and ownership of the book to Anthony Horowitz. Thank you for listening and following along. Let us begin. Chapter 1. The Stone of Vision. It was just before midnight when Queen Elizabeth slipped out of bed and went in search of her magician. Although she had allowed her ladies-in-waiting to lead her into the bedroom and help her undress more than an hour before, she hadn't even tried to sleep. Part of the trouble, of course, was being Queen of England. She could still feel the crown on her head, even when she wasn't wearing it. There was so much to think about, so much to do. But the real problem was her bed. It was a huge, four-postered thing with no fewer than 5 quilts. The first was silk, the next velvet, then there was a gold one and a silver one, and finally, on top, a quilt embroidered with a rather gloomy picture of the Sermon on the Mount. The quilts had been given to her by the Spanish ambassador, the French ambassador, the Dutch ambassador, the German ambassador, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, and she had to use them all so that she did not give offense to any one of them. The result was that even on the coldest winter nights, she was always much too hot. For a moment, she stood in the middle of the room and glanced out of the window. There was a full moon that night which pleased the queen. She knew that the magician would like it. Somehow his spells always worked better when there was a moon, and this one seemed huge, a perfect white circle hanging in the darkness. Her eyes traveled down, and she saw the Thames in ash white as it twisted through the city of London. Everything was silent. The queen nodded. This was the right time. She crossed the room to a tapestry that covered an entire wall. The tapestry showed a lion being hunted, and when she was young, the snaring face with its ugly eyes had given her nightmares. But she was an elderly woman now, 60 years old, and how could she have nightmares when she hardly ever slept? The tapestry was suspended from a rail, and she pulled it aside to reveal a bare brick wall with no visible door or window. At the far end of the wall, over a bookshelf, there was a metal hook. Without hesitating, the queen went over to it and turned it. There was a click, and the whole section of the wall swung inward on a hinged hinge to reveal a jagged opening and a spiral staircase leading down. Gray cobwebs hung in the air. A fat black spider, frightened by the light from the bedroom, tumbled down the brickwork and then scuttled along the floor, disappearing into the shadows. The queen lifted a candle from her room and started forward. Out of the warmth of the bedroom, the stairs were very cold. A draft twisted around her ankles and slithered up her legs. The candle in her hand flickered, and a shadow seemed to jump away, tugging at her as if it could pull her back upstairs. For a moment, she wondered if this was a good idea. She could still turn back, go to bed, and forget all about it. The queen was afraid, but she remembered now what she had done, what she had been forced to do exactly 40 years ago. 40 years of silence. It was time for it to end. She continued down. A moth, attracted by the light, flew into her face. Its feathery wings brushed against her lips, and she gasped out loud. Her hand banged against the wall, and she almost dropped the candle. She stopped for a minute, catching her breath. Then, gripping the candle more tightly, she followed the stairs to their end, passing through an archway and along a corridor where the ceiling curved low over her head, as if groaning under the weight of the great palace 100 yards above. She had reached a door made of thick planks of wood bound together with iron and so low that she had to bend to open it. It reminded her of the door of one of her own dungeons. Her hand found a silver ring, and she turned it. The metal cold against her skin. On the other side, a warm yellow glow and the faint smell of rosemary welcomed her into a small, circular chamber. The door swung shut behind her as she went in. "Good evening, Queen. You were expecting me, wizard." "Oh yes, I knew you were intending to visit me before you had even decided it yourself. Sit down." Nobody else would have dared to talk to Queen Elizabeth in this way. For a start, she could have been called "Your Royal Highness" or "Your Majesty," and nobody ever told her what to do, not even so much as to sit down. But the person seated in the high, wood-packed chair was no ordinary man. Dr. John Dee was 66 years old, but looked much older, having a white mustache and a white beard that came to a point about halfway down his chest. He wore a long black robe and a black cap that would have been painted onto his head. His eyes were brown, a strange watery brown, the color of melted chocolate. There was a gray cat, half asleep on his lap, and he occasionally stroked it with a long, elegant finger. Dr. Dee spoke with a Welsh accent, so rather more remarkably did the cat. "You know why I have to come?" the Queen said. "Of course I do." "Do you know everything, wizard?" Dr. Dee shook his head. "I know many things, Queen, and my stone of vision tells me more, but only God knows everything. I am just a man." "Can you tell me, then, when I am going to die?" the Queen asked. The magician hesitated, his eyes narrowed, and he seemed unsure what to say. Then the cat arched its back, stretched its legs, and suddenly opened its quite brilliant emerald eyes. "Yes, you will die," the cat said, "when you stop breathing." There was a silence in the room. For a long minute the Queen gazed at the cat, then she smiled. "It is a good answer," she said. "That is not the question you came to ask," Dr. Dee muttered. No, suddenly the Queen was nervous. Her fingers closed on a gold locket she was wearing around her neck. She had taken off all her other jewelry for bed, but this locket never left her. It was part of her. "I wish to know about him," she said. "Why now?" "Today is his birthday." She fell silent for a moment, then said, "I think of him all the time, wizard. I know I can never see him, but I still wonder about him, whether he is dead or alive." Dr. Dee stroked the cat. "I can tell you what you want to know," he said, "but I have to warn you now, Queen. It might be better not to ask. Magic has a nasty way of changing things. You cast a spell, you ask for sacred knowledge, and before you know it, you have opened a barrel of worms, or perhaps something worse than worms." "I still have to know," the Queen insisted. "Enough of this, wizard. You have known me long enough to know when my mind is made up. Do your magic. Tell me what you see." "She's making a mistake," the cat murmured. "Hush!" Dr. Dee stroked the cat, then lifted it up and set it to one side. There was a low table between Dr. Dee and the Queen, with a number of objects scattered across the top. These were the tools of the magician's trade. There were 3 or 4 old books, so old that the words seemed to be sinking into the thick, yellowish pages. There were 2 candles, and a tapering wand. Between them lay what looked like an ordinary piece of silvery gray stone, about the size of a dinner plate. Dr. Dee picked it up and cradled it in his hands. "I will need something of his," Dr. Dee said in a low voice. Once again, the Queen's fingers reached for the locket around her neck, but this time she took it and drew it over her head. Nestling it in the palm of one hand, she opened it with the other. Inside the locket was the miniature portrait of a man, and opposite it, a locket of light brown hair. The Queen gazed at the hair for what seemed like an eternity, then let it fall onto the table. "It is all that I have," she said. "Are you prepared to lose it?" There was a flicker of anger in the queen's eyes. "Do what you have to," she said. Dr. D picked up the hair and laid it on the stone. He cupped his hands around the stone without touching it, his eyes fixed on the stone as if he were trying to look through it. The queen leaned forward as she did so. The lock of hair moved. She thought that it had been caught in a draught, but then she realized that the stone had become hot, and that it was the heat that was causing the effect. The air above the stone was shimmering. The color of the stone was changing from gray to white, and then to metallic silver. "No," the word escaped the queen's lips as a gasp. The lock of hair had burst into flame. Now the flickering pieces rose into the air, twisted, and disappeared. The surface of the stone was no longer rough or remotely stony. It had become a mirror, but as Dr. D looked into it, it did not show his reflection. His name was Robert. The magician's eyes were focused in the distance, and the queen knew that he was seeing things outside the room, outside and far away. "Yes, Robert." Even uttering his name was a knife wound she had never done before. "Tell me, wizard, is he alive?" A long silence, and then, "No, queen, he is dead." The queen fell back in her chair, covering her eyes with her hands. Somehow she had always expected it, but like all bad news, it had lost none of its power to hurt. Dr. D was still gazing into the mirror that had been a stone, and there was a look of puzzlement on his face. "What is it?" the queen demanded. "I don't know." And then, as if a cloud had parted and the sun had broken through, the magician looked up. "He had a son," he said. "What?" "Robert is dead, but his son is still alive." The queen gripped the sides of her chair. "Where is he? What is he called? What do you know about him?" "He is far from here. I cannot see his name." The stone was getting hotter and hotter. The very air inside the chamber was beginning to burn. "Try! You must try!" "No. All I can see is a castle and a pig. It is difficult." Dr. D waved a hand over the stone, clearing the smoke. "The pig is outside the castle, and over that the boy." "Is he still a boy? How old is he?" 13. The castle. Dr. D frowned. "They are building chimneys on the castle. Strange looking chimneys. I can see the boy limping past the castle, and he's looking at the chimneys and—" "Why is he limping?" "Because of the pig." "Why must your answers be so mysterious, wizard?" "Where is the boy? If you can't tell me his name, at least tell me where he is." But before Dr. D could reply, there was a sudden crackle, like a musket going off. At the same time, the mirror shattered. 1,000 cracks exploded across its surface. Then the cracks faded, and a second later, the stone was exactly as it had been, lying flat and ordinary on the table. "That is all I can tell you, queen." Dr. D picked up the stone. It was quite cool to the touch. "But you have spies and men of intelligence. It should be enough." "A castle, strange chimneys, and a pig. Another of your wretched riddles, wizard. Where do I even start?" Framlingham, the cat, which had been quite forgotten during all this, leapt onto Dr. D's lap. "They're building chimneys on Framlingham Castle." "How do you know?" the queen asked. The cat shrugged. "A little bird told me," it remarked. And then I ate the little bird. Framlingham and Suffolk. The queen got to her feet. "Only 4 or 5 days from here. You have done well, wizard. You have my thanks, and will have much more." The queen left, climbing back up the secret staircase to her bedroom. She was still awake when the sun rose above the thatched roofs and wooden houses of London, and the first horses stumbled along the rough, pitted tracks that were the city's roads. The year was 1593. The queen, of course, was Elizabeth I, and she was already planning the course of events that would change one boy's life forever, and with it, the entire history of the country she ruled. This marks the end of chapter 1. I thank you for following along, and please disregard the lapses of and the errors I have made. This is my first sitting and first reading. I promise with time I shall strive for improvements. I thank you for your patience, and please look forward to the next video.